Most people think neighborhood wars start over fences, barking dogs, or somebody parking where they shouldn't. Mine started because a woman named Denise Mercer convinced herself that sunlight was community property. And if that sounds ridiculous, trust me, it gets worse. 3 weeks after I caught her stealing electricity from my private solar grid, her luxury electric SUV was sitting dead in her driveway, a blackened charging cable hanging from the side, like a smoking fuse after a cartoon explosion. The crazy part wasn't that it happened. The crazy part was that she somehow believed I owed her an apology. Now, before we get there, you need to understand what this solar system meant to me. My name's Ethan Cole, and I'm an electrical engineer. For almost 2 years, every weekend, every vacation day, every free afternoon, I was outside building the off-grid energy system I dreamed about since college. I wasn't one of those guys who bought a kit and paid somebody else to install it. Every wire was measured by me. Every battery bank was designed by me. Every safety relay, monitoring circuit, and backup system was engineered with my own hands. By the time it was finished, I'd invested over $30,000 and more hours than I could count. Sure, it helped lower costs, but that wasn't really the point. The point was independence. If the utility company went down, my lights stayed on. If rates doubled, I didn't care. The whole project represented freedom, and that's exactly why Denise hated it. Denise happened to be the HOA treasurer, though calling her treasurer was like calling a mall security guard the president of the United States. She'd volunteered when nobody else wanted the position, then immediately started acting like she'd been elected ruler of the neighborhood. Within months, she was issuing warnings over mailbox colors, measuring grass with a ruler, and sending violation letters because kids left bicycles on front porches. Half the neighborhood avoided eye contact when they saw her walking down the street. The other half hid in their houses. Naturally, when my solar panels went up, Denise saw them as a personal challenge. She tried filing a complaint for what she called visual inconsistency with community aesthetics. I showed her the permits. I showed her the city approvals. I politely explained that my off-grid system wasn't connected to HOA property and wasn't subject to her opinions. That conversation ended with a smile on my face and steam practically coming out of her ears. Looking back, I should have realized she wasn't going to let it go. The first sign something was wrong came at 2 o'clock in the morning. I woke up to an alert from my monitoring system. One of the battery banks was experiencing an unexpected overnight load spike. At first I thought maybe a sensor was malfunctioning. Then I looked at the numbers. Somebody was pulling serious power. I threw on a jacket and stepped outside. That's when I saw it. Parked beside my driveway was Denise's silver electric SUV, plugged directly into my exterior charging station. She was standing there under the security light with her arms crossed, completely relaxed, like she was watering flowers in her own yard. For a few seconds I honestly thought I was dreaming. Then she looked at me and smiled. "Oh good, you're awake," she said. "I didn't want you to think somebody was stealing." I remember staring at her, trying to process what I'd just heard. "Denise, why is your car plugged into my charger?" She actually looked confused by the question. "Because you weren't using it." That was her answer. Not an apology, not an excuse, just pure entitlement. I told her she couldn't connect to a private electrical system without permission. She shrugged. "We're part of the same community, Ethan. Besides, it's solar power. It's basically free." Free. I nearly laughed. Anybody who's ever installed renewable energy knows there is nothing free about it. The panels cost money. The batteries cost money. The equipment costs money. Maintenance costs money. But Denise had already created a story in her head where my investment somehow belonged to everyone. When I pointed that out, she rolled her eyes and said, "You should be happy I'm using clean energy instead of gasoline." Then she unplugged her vehicle and drove away like she'd done me a favor. The next morning, I checked my system logs. That's when things got interesting. Her vehicle hadn't been there once. It had been there repeatedly, night after night, week after week. My cameras confirmed everything. Sometimes she'd show up after midnight, sometimes closer to dawn. Every visit looked the same. She'd sneak over, plug in, wait a few hours, then leave. According to my calculations, she'd already taken hundreds of dollars worth of electricity. What shocked me wasn't the theft. It was the confidence. Most thieves try not to get caught. Denise behaved like she genuinely believed she had permission. I printed the logs, organized the footage, and walked to her front door. I wasn't looking for a fight. Honestly, I wanted the easiest solution possible. I showed her the evidence and offered a compromise. Stop using the charger, reimburse part of the cost, and we'd move on. She glanced at the paperwork for maybe 3 seconds before laughing. Then she said something I'll never forget. "You seriously expect me to pay you for sunlight?" And with that, she slammed the door in my face. A week later, a violation notice appeared in my mailbox. Denise had filed an official HOA complaint accusing me of monopolizing renewable resources and restricting community access to energy infrastructure. I wish I were making that up. The letter actually claimed that HOA leadership possessed oversight authority regarding neighborhood utility assets. Reading that nonsense while standing in my driveway was the moment I realized this wasn't about electricity anymore. It wasn't about money either. Denise had convinced herself that rules only applied to other people. And the worst part about people like that is they never stop on their own. So that evening, I sat down in my workshop, opened my design software, reviewed weeks of footage, and started planning something very specific. Not revenge, not sabotage, just an opportunity for Denise Mercer to finally experience the consequences of ignoring a boundary she had been warned about over and over again. Now, before I tell you what happened next, let me pause for a second because this is where a lot of HOA disputes go sideways. People assume the conflict is about the thing being stolen, whether that's electricity, water, parking space, or property access, but most of the time it's actually about entitlement. This is a psychological trap. Once someone gets away with crossing a boundary repeatedly, they stop seeing it as your boundary at all. In their mind, they've rewritten the rules. Denise wasn't sneaking over because she desperately needed electricity. She drove a luxury SUV and lived in one of the largest houses in the neighborhood. She was doing it because nobody had successfully told her no in a very long time. According to standard procedure, when unauthorized use of private utilities is documented, the property owner should gather evidence, provide notice, and create a record of the violation. From a legal perspective, electricity generated by a privately owned solar system is still private property. It doesn't magically become public because sunlight helped create it. The lesson here is that small acts of entitlement rarely stay small. If they're never challenged, they tend to grow into something much bigger, and that's exactly what was about to happen. Over the next few days, I didn't confront Denise again, didn't send angry emails, didn't argue with the HOA, and that silence probably made her feel invincible. Meanwhile, I was busy documenting everything. Every visit, every charging session, every violation notice she filed, every ridiculous claim she made about community energy rights. The funny thing about engineering is that it trains you to solve problems methodically. You gather data, identify failure points, test assumptions, and then create a solution. Denise thought she was dealing with an annoyed neighbor. What she was actually dealing with was a guy who spent his career building systems designed to predict human behavior. And by that point, her behavior was becoming incredibly predictable. Every Saturday night, she charged her vehicle. Every time she assumed nobody was watching. Every time she ignored warnings. So I built something that would allow her to make one more bad decision completely on her own. I installed a secondary charging station housing beside my workshop. From the outside, it looked nearly identical to the original charger she'd been using. The difference was that this unit wasn't connected to my primary charging equipment. Instead, it was connected to a testing circuit designed for equipment diagnostics. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't dangerous when used properly. It was clearly marked with warning labels stating private testing equipment, authorized use only. Most people would have seen those signs and walked away. Denise was not most people. The following Saturday, I stayed up late watching system activity on my monitor. Around 11:43, a motion alert appeared. Right on schedule. I opened the camera feed and there she was. Hoodie, pajama pants, coffee mug in one hand, charging cable in the other. The casual confidence was almost impressive. She didn't hesitate, didn't read the warning signs, didn't knock on my door, didn't ask permission. She simply walked across the property line and plugged her vehicle into equipment that didn't belong to her. Then she returned home. 10 minutes later, the system registered a fault event. Not an explosion, not some Hollywood fireball, just an abrupt electrical protection shut down exactly as designed. But from Denise's perspective, it probably felt much more dramatic. The vehicle immediately stopped charging. Internal protection systems triggered. Diagnostic errors appeared. Moments later, every exterior light on the SUV went dark. A second camera angle showed Denise rushing outside, staring at the dashboard, then pacing around the vehicle in complete confusion. I won't lie. After weeks of dealing with her nonsense, watching that footage felt incredibly satisfying. The next morning I was making coffee when somebody started pounding on my front door hard enough to rattle the windows. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Denise was standing there looking like she'd spent the entire night rehearsing an argument. Behind her stood 2 HOA board members, including a retired accountant named Frank who always looked exhausted by life. Denise immediately pointed toward her driveway. "You damaged my vehicle." No hello. No explanation. Straight to the accusation. I looked past her at the SUV. A tow truck sat nearby. The charging port cover was open. Diagnostic equipment was connected to the vehicle. Clearly she'd already called for service. "Good morning to you too," I said. That only made her angrier. Frank stepped forward and gave me the kind of look people use when they know they're walking into a disaster. "Ethan, Denise says there was some kind of incident involving your charger." "Not my charger," I replied. "Her decision." Denise nearly exploded. "You set a trap." "No," I said calmly. "I installed private testing equipment on private property with warning labels clearly visible. You trespassed and connected your vehicle without authorization." For a second nobody spoke. Then Denise launched into a speech about community access, shared resources, HOA authority, and what she called implied neighborhood cooperation. The more she talked, the worse it sounded. Finally I went inside and returned carrying a large binder. I handed it directly to Frank. Inside were printed photographs, timestamps, charging logs, energy consumption reports, screenshots from security cameras, copies of HOA complaints, and records documenting every unauthorized charging session. Frank flipped through the pages. His eyebrows kept climbing higher. The second board member leaned over his shoulder. By page 10 both men were staring at Denise instead of me. "You've been using his charger for weeks?" Frank asked. Denise immediately changed tactics. "That's not the point. Whenever somebody says that's not the point, it usually means you've found exactly the point." Frank kept reading. "And he asked you to stop?" Silence. "And you filed complaints against him afterward?" More silence. Denise's face turned bright red. What happened next surprised even me. Instead of apologizing or backing down, she doubled down. She demanded that the HOA force me to compensate her for repair costs. She claimed my equipment had interfered with her vehicle. She insisted my solar system represented a community hazard. She threatened lawsuits. She threatened inspections. She threatened media attention. It was like watching somebody step harder on the accelerator while driving toward a cliff. The board members finally left carrying copies of my documentation. 3 days later, an emergency HOA meeting was scheduled. Word spread through the neighborhood fast. By the time the meeting started, nearly every seat was occupied. Most people weren't there because they cared about electricity. They were there because Denise had spent years making enemies. This was the first time anyone had publicly challenged her authority. The meeting lasted almost 3 hours. Security footage was reviewed. Documentation was examined. Statements were collected. One by one, neighbors began sharing their own experiences. A retired couple described receiving violation notices over flower arrangements. Another resident revealed that Denise had repeatedly misrepresented HOA rules. Someone else produced emails showing she had threatened fines she had no authority to issue. The entire thing snowballed. Every complaint people had quietly tolerated for years suddenly surfaced at once. According to standard procedure, HOA officers are expected to act within the authority granted by governing documents. What became painfully obvious that night was that Denise had been operating on personal opinion rather than actual authority. By the end of the meeting, the discussion wasn't about my solar system anymore. It was about her conduct. Then came the vote. I'll never forget the silence. Denise sat at the front of the room, gripping a folder so tightly her knuckles were white. The board reviewed the findings. Motions were proposed. Ballots were cast. A few minutes later, the results were announced. Effective immediately, Denise was removed from her leadership position pending further review. Several complaints she had issued were suspended. Additional records would be audited. The room remained quiet for about 2 seconds before people started whispering. Denise looked stunned. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Just genuinely shocked. As if she'd never considered the possibility that actions could have consequences. She stood up, accused everyone of betrayal. declared the neighborhood ungrateful, and stormed out before the meeting ended. Over the following weeks, the situation unraveled even further. Investigations revealed procedural violations in multiple HOA decisions. Several residents successfully appealed old fines. Denise's authority disappeared almost overnight. Meanwhile, the repair estimate for her vehicle arrived. It wasn't cheap. Modern electric vehicles are complicated machines, and unauthorized interaction with equipment can create expensive problems very quickly. Her attorney eventually contacted me seeking information. I provided documentation. My attorney provided documentation. After reviewing the evidence, the conversation became much shorter. There simply wasn't much room for argument when video footage showed repeated unauthorized use of private property despite warnings and prior notice. The most ironic part of the whole story was that none of this would have happened if she'd simply stopped the first time I asked. I wasn't trying to win a war. I wasn't trying to embarrass her. I just wanted her to respect a boundary. Instead, she convinced herself that ownership was negotiable, permission was optional, and consequences were something that happened to other people. By the time she realized she was wrong, the entire neighborhood had already watched the lesson unfold in real time. Looking back now, the thing I remember most isn't the HOA meeting, the security footage, or even the sight of Denise standing in my driveway, trying to explain why my electricity somehow belonged to her. What sticks with me is how unbelievably normal the whole thing felt while it was happening. That's the strange part about entitlement. It rarely arrives wearing a villain costume. Most of the time it shows up disguised as a small exception, a harmless shortcut, or a favor someone thinks they're entitled to take without asking. Then one day you realize that what started as a minor boundary crossing has quietly evolved into something much bigger. After everything settled down, I spent a lot of evenings sitting on my back patio watching the solar array do exactly what I built it to do. The system still powered my house. The batteries still filled every afternoon. The monitoring screens still glowed inside the workshop. In a funny way, the project ended up teaching me something completely different from what I originally intended. I thought I was building energy independence. What I actually learned was the importance of defending boundaries before people convince themselves they no longer exist. From a legal perspective, ownership only works when people are willing to respect it. Whether we're talking about electricity, land, water, tools, equipment, or even personal time, the principle is exactly the same. The moment someone decides your property belongs to them simply because they want it, conflict becomes almost inevitable. And here's the part one think a lot of people miss. Denise didn't wake up one morning planning to become the villain of the neighborhood. She gradually trained herself to believe that her judgment mattered more than everyone else's rights. That's why situations like this are so common in HOA disputes. This is a psychological trap. When people spend enough time exercising authority without accountability, they can start confusing influence with ownership and leadership with control. According to standard procedure, healthy communities function because everyone agrees to the same rules, not because one person gets to invent new ones whenever it's convenient. The lesson here is that boundaries aren't hostile. They're necessary. Saying no doesn't make you selfish. Protecting your property doesn't make you unreasonable. Expecting basic respect doesn't make you difficult. In fact, most neighborhood conflicts become disasters precisely because people avoid addressing small problems early. They hope common sense will eventually win. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. In my case, common sense had to arrive carrying several binders of evidence and a stack of security footage. These days the neighborhood is a lot quieter. New HOA leadership focuses on actual community issues instead of personal crusades. People seem more relaxed. The solar system is still running perfectly. And every now and then I'll see a neighbor walking by who remembers the entire saga and can't help laughing about it. Honestly, I laugh too. Not because Denise lost her position, but because the entire situation could have been avoided with one simple question. Hey Ethan, would you mind if I used your charger? That's it. One conversation. One moment of respect. Instead, she chose entitlement. And entitlement has a way of generating its own invoice eventually. So now I'm curious what you think. If you discovered a neighbor had been secretly using your private solar system for weeks, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have gone straight to lawyers, police reports, or something else entirely? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. And honestly, That's what makes them so fascinating.